My name's Sue Regan. I am the Policy Director and Deputy CEO here at Volunteering Australia. And welcome to today's event, which is a very exciting part of developing the evidence base for the National Strategy for Volunteering. I'm going to hand over to Mark Pearce, who's here today, who's CEO of Volunteering Australia, who will provide the acknowledgement of country.
Thanks, Sue, and welcome everyone. It's a joy to see so many faces here to join us for this launch. It's my pleasure to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we all meet on today. This particular continent has enjoyed community participation, community development for over 60,000 years, and the work that we all do is part of an extensive tradition that's been taking place on the various countries that we're meeting on today. For me, I'm on the lands of the Uggerah and Turrbal people in what we now call Brisbane. These traditional custodians have an unbroken connection to land and sea of over 30,000 years. Again, an extensive tradition. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend my respects on behalf of Volunteering Australia and all here today to all First Peoples, and sincerely welcome all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people who may well be joining us today. This tradition that we're part of is an important one, and the information, the data that we've collected, and this process, I suppose, adds some additional motivation to that which we do, which has been taking place here for so long. So welcome.
Thank you, Mark. But I'm going to just run through what's going to happen in the next hour. I think, Jack, you're going to share a few slides just so people know what's coming up. So first of all, we'll have Professor Melanie Oppenheimer, who is chair of the Research Working Group for the National Strategy for Volunteering. She will be introducing the Volunteering Research Papers Initiative. We will then have 7 3-minute presentations, which I'm going to try and keep people to time, because after the presentations, we would really like the opportunity to have a bit of Q&A time as well. And, you know, during the Q&A, put your hand up, or you can write a question in the chat function. But please, you know, if you are directing your question to a particular author, then please do that in your chat function. So in terms of the presentations, first of all, we will have Vivien Forner. We will then, who's giving us a wave, we'll then have Christel Mex. We will then have Mario Peucker, followed by Arthur Stukas. I can see these people are all in the room, which is great. We will then have Darja Kragt, followed by Amber Tsai, and then finally we will have Debbie Haski-Leventhal, who has a rather intermittent internet at the moment. So she has kindly provided us with a short 3-minute video. So if she can't speak, we will play the video for her. Right. So I'm going to now hand over to Melanie, who will introduce the initiative.
Thank you very much, Sue, and welcome to everybody. This is a wonderful event. I'm delighted to have been invited to chair the National Strategy for Volunteering Research Working Group. We are a small committee of interdisciplinary academics from around Australia who've been working together since late last year. We've been meeting monthly to provide academic expertise to the National Strategy so that it is informed by rigorous, wide-ranging and current research evidence. So one of the outcomes of the Research Working Group is a series of volunteering research insight papers. Now, these papers are peer-reviewed and will feed directly into the development of the National Strategy. So each volunteering research insight paper focuses on a topic relevant to the design of the National Strategy for Volunteering. The primary aim is to capture existing research knowledge and feed it into the strategy but in an accessible way that practitioners and all of those involved in the volunteering ecosystem around Australia can easily read and understand. A small editorial board was established to oversee the process, and we've ended up with 22 papers being accepted. So this afternoon, as Sue has said, you'll hear the first 7 papers, and this will be the first of 3 rounds. So we've got this one, the second one will be held in November, and then the last one will be in late January 2023. I'm really looking forward to listening to the presenters. I want to thank you so much for your attendance this afternoon. I'm sure you'll find something here of interest to your own organisation, to your own volunteering practices, or for your own research. So thank you very much, and back to you, Sue.
Thank you, Melanie. That was wonderful. So we're going to go straight into the presentations now. And first up, we have Vivien Forner, who's from the University of Sydney, who's going to be presenting on her paper, which is called The Great Volunteer Resignation, an evidence-based strategy for retaining volunteers. Vivien, over to you.
Thank you, and welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time to come and join us today and hear all about the exciting research that we're doing in this space. We're currently in the grips of a significant and unprecedented decline in volunteer numbers. So based on reports from the United Nations, 44% of the global volunteer workforce stopped volunteering over a 4-year period from 2018 to 2021. This devastating loss during COVID actually exacerbates an existing problem in Australia, where we've seen a steady deterioration in volunteer participation rates over the past 5 years. So long story short, this is a big problem, and addressing turnover of volunteers has therefore become a strategic national imperative, which will be vital to ensure the future sustainability of Australia's volunteering sector. So to solve this problem, we recommend implementing an evidence-based strategy targeting the key drivers of volunteer retention. So particularly what aspects of the volunteering experience are most important in driving volunteers' decision to stay or leave an organisation. If we understand the key levers, we can then focus our actions to have the greatest impact. So this was the focus of our research. Our broader research team has spent the past 2 years conducting a systematic review and meta-analysis to summarise the current state of evidence. So we've gathered all the research ever that has ever examined indicators of volunteer turnover. We manually screened over 3,000 studies and analysed the combined results. So our results reveal that there's lots of predictors of turnover and retention, and we do present the full results in our academic paper, which is currently under review for publication. So in the Volunteer Australian Research paper, we present an industry summary of the findings. We wanted to focus on things that organisations can take practical action on, and we chose to present 4 key themes that have the strongest body of evidence. For example, one of these themes was autonomy. So autonomy is important for volunteer retention, and to retain volunteers, it's important to enable volunteers opportunities for decision-making, to have choices, to provide input and voice their opinion. And this should be at the forefront of mind when designing volunteer roles and activities. So overall, our findings provide the volunteer sector with some insights about the strongest determinants of volunteer turnover and the key levers for retaining volunteers. And in doing so, we offer an evidence-based framework for minimising turnover rates and ensuring the future sustainability of the sector. I also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge my co-authors who also contributed to this industry output, Dr. Dejul Holtrop, Dr. Anya Johnson, and Dr. Darja Kragt.
Thank you, Vivien. That was fantastic. And I should have said, all the papers with the key insights are available on the National Strategy website. Thank you, Vivien. That got us off to a great start. Next up, we've got Christel Mex, who's affiliated with the University of Flinders University. And her paper is entitled The Free Fall of Volunteer Leaders in Australian Grassroots Associations. Christel, I can see you there. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Very pleased to be here. And my research is based on a PhD thesis that I did with Melanie. She was my supervisor at Flinders in 2019. And the paper is called The Free Fall of Volunteer Leaders in Australian Grassroots Association. So why did I choose this topic? Back in 2001, it was the International Year for Volunteers declared by the United Nations. And I was the first manager of the Office for Volunteers here in Adelaide. And it was a government agency, which is pretty new at that time. And I was invited to lots of AGMs, especially by the small community groups who wanted to get noticed. But I noticed that over time that people were not standing for committees. You know, at the end of the meeting, they call for nominations and everybody was very quiet. There might be 50 people in the room, but nobody was raising their hand. And, you know, and then you'd see begrudgingly the old leaders raising their hand. So I still find this happening as a councillor. So back in 2018, I became an elected member for the city of Norwood, and I still am. I'm in my second term, still going to AGMs, and I'm still seeing that plight of leaders. People are reluctant to raise their hands. So I was interested in doing this topic a bit further to find out why this was happening, because this is on top of Vivien's findings that people are leaving volunteers, and this has been happening since 2010. So now just 29% of our population are volunteering. But I think it's happening. The effect of this is more crucial for community groups. So David Horton-Smith is a researcher in the United States who researches grassroots associations, and he defined them as volunteer-run and community-based organizations. And I found in 2010, the Australian Productivity Commission did a report into charities, and some of the data showed that there are about 440,000 grassroots associations in Australia. They make up 67% of all nonprofits. So it's a huge sector of our family. But most research concentrates on NGOs with paid staff, and they have formal reporting requirements, so it's much more data for them. And because PhD theses have to be very specific, my thesis focused on the leaders of these associations and why their numbers were under threat. My methodology had 12 focus groups in metro, rural, and regional South Australia, and I interviewed both leaders and regular members of these small associations. This was followed up with a survey which had 1,500 respondents from both small groups and larger NGOs. And the survey was completed by leaders and regular members. And I have to say, I put this out just before Christmas, and there were lots of people interested. I kept hearing the bell ring on my computer. And boy, when I read the survey respondents, there were over 500 comments, which all had to be read and analyzed. It was amazing how much interest there was in this survey. So to the findings very quickly, the reasons why people join the committees in the first place was really for enjoyment, ability to influence the outcomes of their issue or their social interaction, and using their skills to make a difference. The barriers that they reported to me were, interestingly, group politics was a very big one, a very major one. This could be from an extreme range of bullying, really bad behaviors, just back to the simple not being open to new ideas, not willing to use social media, change with the times. So I called this bad behavior, really. But also lack of time was a big reason people don't join the committees. Increase in red tape by local, state, and federal bureaucracies. We want to ask them to fill out very large application forms, and we have a lot of requirements on small groups. But the difference between small groups and larger organizations is that the groups I looked into, they don't have any paid staff at all. They rely on volunteer effort and volunteer leaders. So for them to get around all the red tape requirements is quite challenging for them.
Christel, I'm going to have to stop you, but that's any.
Thank you.
Do you have a final sentence, or that was a great summary?
It's complicated, and we need to look into them as well as larger NGOs.
That's great. Thank you very much, Christel. Right, Mario, you're up next, and you're presenting, your title of your paper is Volunteering Within Ethno-Religious Community Contexts, Empirical Insights with a Focus on Muslim Intra-Community Engagement in Australia. Over to you, Mario.
Thanks, Sue, and no time to lose. The latest census data have demonstrated once again how culturally diverse Australia is. not only does the proportion of people born overseas continue to rise, but the demographic composition is also changing significantly, with more and more people from non-English speaking and non-European background calling Australia home. And these demographic developments affect many aspects of social and community life, including the volunteering sector. As our civil society becomes more and more pluralistic, the term mainstream is increasingly losing its meaning. So the mainstream is now culturally, linguistically, and religiously diverse. The volunteering sector has responded to this diversity by trying to make volunteering spaces more accessible and culturally inclusive and welcoming for people from different backgrounds. And this reducing cultural barriers is, of course, an important and necessary step and an important area of work. However, what has received less attention is the empirically well-established fact that people from multicultural and multi-faith communities often tend to volunteer within their own community spaces, their organizations in mosques, temples, and other religious and ethnic community contexts. And often they do not even consider this kind of community work as volunteering. These forms of intra-community volunteering, as we call it, are quite common and are an ordinary part of community life in multicultural societies. But they remain quantitatively underestimated and qualitatively misunderstood and underappreciated, despite the fact that this kind of volunteering has the same positive effects as any other form of volunteering, and there may be even be additional positive implications, which I can't go into now. Our own research on Australian Muslim community volunteering, for example, has shown that instead of creating socially isolated or isolating bubbles, as it is sometimes falsely assumed, intra-community volunteering strengthens social networks and builds bridges to other civil society organizations, creating new opportunities for cross-community engagement. It fosters people's sense of belonging and self-confidence, strengthens both their civic and religious identity, as well as their civic and political awareness and commitment. Intra-community volunteering is both a manifestation of and a catalyst for active citizenship for people from diverse backgrounds. Not only the pool of potential volunteers has become much more diverse, but also the organizational structures of our civil society where volunteering can and does take place. This offers new and untapped opportunities, but harnessing these opportunities will require policymakers, practitioners, and other stakeholders in the volunteering sector to acknowledge, value, and actively promote intra-community volunteering, not at the expense of volunteering in other organizational contexts, but as an ordinary part of volunteering in a society where diversity is the new mainstream. Thank you. Did I make it in 3 minutes?
You did, Mario. You were a second under, so thank you. Thank you very much, Mario. I enjoyed reading all of the papers, and so please do, read them after this event. But I learned a lot from reading yours, Mario. And please do add questions to the chat function when thoughts occur to you, and we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. Art, it's over to you. We've now got Art Stukas, who's from La Trobe University, and his papers on understanding motivations to volunteer.
Thanks, Sue. And I wrote this paper with Sarah Wilson, who's also here. So thanks, Sarah, and it's a team effort. In this paper, we wanted to convince you, if you're not already convinced, that understanding the motivations of your volunteers is an important thing, and it enables maybe better recruitment, and if it's needed, sustained volunteering, in helping with retention as well. So our starting premise is that understanding why volunteers choose to work for your organization is an important thing to do. We believe that different volunteers may choose the same activity for very different reasons. And of course, that volunteers may also have multiple motivations for the work that they do. So for example, volunteers may seek to express their important values through their volunteer work. They may want to understand a social issue or different people in their community, or even their own skills. They may want to feel a bit of self-enhancement, perhaps, feeling better about themselves. They may want to distract themselves from their own problems or troubles. and potentially gain career opportunities and skills. You've heard all this before. You know these are some of the goals that volunteers bring to your organizations. So why is it important to know them or to assess them? Well, as I said, they could help with recruitment to the extent that you know the profile of your potential volunteers. Then advertising the benefits that they could achieve through working with your organization is something that we know can enhance their ability to choose to work with you. So a matched message that targets the motivations and the goals that they may have for their work can improve the recruitment of volunteers that will be potentially satisfied by working with your organization. That's the second piece, that if you are able to offer an opportunity that allows volunteers to fulfill their initial motivations, to satisfy their goals, then they should be happier volunteers and potentially more effective volunteers and want to stay, again, bearing in mind that sometimes motivations change and we want to keep track of that. So these conclusions come from our functional approach to volunteering, which came from Gil Clary and Mark Snyder, who were my PhD supervisors. And so that was a number of years ago. We do have a questionnaire, the Volunteer Functions Inventory, that assesses motivations. And if you want a copy of it, you can certainly email me, and I'm happy to share. More recently, research has started to talk about differences between other-oriented and self-oriented volunteering. And it's possible that other-oriented motivation is associated with greater well-being. This needs to be further investigated. So there's some possibilities that volunteering does lead to improvements in well-being, and maybe for other-oriented volunteers. But again, we need to understand if it's certain activities that promote well-being more than other activities, if it's certain kinds of people that benefit more than other kinds of people. So the jury is still out on this. I will sort of close by saying I agree with Vivien that self-determination theory and its focus on autonomy and competence and relatedness that can be offered through volunteering is a way to also encourage well-being. But bearing in mind that helping people to satisfy their initial goals is one way to make sure that volunteering is sustained and satisfying. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Art. That was really fantastic. I love the way that the presenters are already drawing links between the other papers. It's very helpful. Right, next up is Darja Kragt, and she is going to be presenting on the topic of Without Leadership, There Is No Volunteering, the importance of strategic investment in leadership development in Australia. Over to you, Darja.
Thanks very much, Sue, and thanks for having me here today. I'd like to acknowledge also my co-authors who are all here. It's Vivien, Toby, and Sarah. We've been going pretty hard here, so I want you to pause and take 5 seconds and think, who has been the best leader you have ever had in your life? Okay, the image popped in, hopefully for everyone. Then think very quickly as well, what has been the impact that this person has had on your life and on you? Okay, so hopefully you have the image. Now, with this image in mind, let's consider how important is leadership to volunteering. And obviously, from the title of our paper, you will recognize that it is pretty or very, very important. And so we wrote this paper in a hope to really draw attention to the importance of leadership in the volunteering context. Now, volunteering doesn't just happen. Volunteers are people, and as all people in all different contexts and organizations need to be organized, managed, and led. And this is where the role of leaders of volunteers becomes really, really crucial. So we really strongly advocate for the need to invest in leadership development in the sector and all the different organizations that are represented by this sector. Because we know that leadership is crucial to volunteering. We have some research in the paper to give some evidence to that, so you're welcome to have a look. But we also know that currently our volunteer leaders feel like they're not being supported enough in their role as leaders first and then administrators and managers second. So we think that this investment in leadership development can be really crucial to change that. So we advocate for leadership development that recognizes the incredible capacity for leadership that we already have. We have great people in the sector. I'm sure you will all agree with me. Leadership development that gives those people and other people more skills and opportunities to invest in leadership and become better leaders. And think what impact this might have, not just on the volunteering sector, but also on our communities. Because in the end of the day, we're leaders, not just in volunteering, we're leaders in workplaces, in communities, and everywhere else. So I really invite you to read the paper and our little manifesto for leadership development. And it's a pleasure to be sharing this with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darja. Thank you to you and your co-authors who are here as well. Right, we're going to keep moving on. Next up, we've got Tsai, who's from the University of Tasmania, and she's going to be talking about emergency volunteering, leading engagement and retention. Over to you, Amber.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amber, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Tasmania. So this paper is written by me and my two supervisors, Toby Newstead and Gemma Lewis. So firstly, I will talk about what this paper is based on. And secondly, I will take some examples from my PhD research. And then I will touch on the implications on practice. So when we think of emergency volunteering, we will think of those who get themselves involved when there's a disaster. When things are urgent, most people will be willing to volunteer. But so the issue here for the emergency services is not so much about getting people through the door to save lives. The bigger issue is how to get people to stay through the quiet seasons. In Australia, 90% of the first responders are volunteers. This means that when we have a house fire, a car accident, it's likely that we rely on a long-term and trained volunteer who knows how to handle the difficult situations safely. Most of the literature we review mentioned that leadership plays a crucial role in retaining volunteers, but the configurations of leadership is a bit different in this context. There is a prevalence of a hierarchical or military-like ranking tradition, but command does not equal to leadership. And it takes more than just technical skills to be a good leader of emergency services volunteers. So our research asks volunteers what good leadership is to them. And we found that it's the simple things that can make or break their willingness to stay. So here are some of what some of my research participants said. When we're all feeling exhausted after a long hour shift, the leaders still make the effort to show concern. They give recognitions that were unexpected. They speak up for us when the upper management browbeat us. They make sure everyone feels included. But one volunteer also said, it's like a lucky draw whether they get a good leader or not. Sometimes when a volunteer level up their rank, their ego can get into the way. So these findings are not new. In the paper, we noted down the resources that were already made relevant to practice. We also highlighted that developing leadership takes time and organizational support. Leaders of volunteers are often volunteers themselves. They can be juggling the expectations from both volunteers, organizations, and communities without having the know-how. So in the paper, we suggested ways that organizations can learn about the required and the preferred leadership and be explicit about leadership practices. So again, why we should care about good volunteer leadership, because it's simply the way we ensure that we have the people we need at difficult times. And in doing so, we help to keep the community safe. Thank you.
Amber, thank you very much for that. Right, we're now moving on to the final presentation, which is Debbie Haski-Leventhal. Debbie, what would you like us to do? How reliable is your internet? I'm going to leave it in your hands. Jack's standing ready to play the video if you would prefer.
I'm not too sure about this internet connectivity, so let's run the pre-recorded video. What is corporate volunteering? How is it changing? What do we need to know?
Hi, everyone. My name is Professor Debbie Haski-Leventhal from Macquarie University. And in the next 3 minutes, I'll be talking about corporate volunteering and its implications for practice and policy. What do we mean by corporate volunteering and why is it important? So corporate volunteering is quite popular in Australia with over 3/4 of Australian companies offering some sort of corporate volunteering opportunities for their employees. It occurs when employers involve their employees in their corporate social responsibility, oftentimes by organizing or enabling the employees participating in some kind of voluntary work through their general work. And so there are many motivations to why companies do it and why employees participate. And we can divide them to instrumental, that it serves the company, serves the person, relational, and altruistic drives, which is kind of similar to why people volunteer in general. So for companies, it really helps to engage their employees, enhance the company's reputation, and help them do something meaningful for the community. For employees, it's a great way to find more meaning in their work, to feel like there is a sense of significance to what they're doing, to connect with others in the workplace and with the community. And for not-for-profit organizations in the community, they get a lot of helping hands in the organization, helping to achieve what needs to be achieved and to serve their recipients or their causes. There are also similarly quite a lot of benefits to all stakeholders who participate in corporate volunteering. There are benefits to the employers, to the employees, the ones I've just mentioned, to not-for-profit, and to the community as well. But to achieve these benefits, corporate volunteering needs to be done well. What do I mean by done well? Firstly, let's categorize corporate volunteering and explain that it can be done as a one-off or ongoing giving of time. And many corporations now understand that a one-day year of volunteering is not the best way of engaging employees and serving the community. Also, it can be skill-based volunteering where employees use the same skills they use in their paid roles, paid jobs to volunteer. It can be done as a team effort or an individual effort and so on. There are also new ways of involving employees through corporate volunteering, including digital volunteering, where employees volunteer online, or they could volunteer with their families, with their kids in family volunteering. There is a new trend of social entrepreneurship, where employees use their innovation and creative thinking to come up with social solutions to wicked problems. So there are 4 things that I would like to end with as important lessons to how to facilitate corporate volunteering well. One is to start with the needs of the community. Do not start corporate volunteering as a company just to build the teams or offer some fun for the employees. It's important to come out from the needs of the community. And that really is important because when employees do volunteering work that I don't feel is meaningful enough, they don't want to do it again. So by coming out of the needs of the community and doing something that's impactful and meaningful, you also get to engage the employees more. It's important to create ongoing multi-sectorial partnerships. So instead of having a one-off collaboration, to have collaborations and partnerships that go all year round, in which corporate volunteering is only one small part of this partnership. It's also important to enable employees-led initiatives where employees could come up with their own ideas of how and where to volunteer, and to provide the resources and support needed both for the not-for-profit organizations and to the employees. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. The full paper on corporate volunteering is going to be released with all the other papers, and I hope you will find this information very beneficial. Thank you very much.
Debbie, thank you very much. And thank you very much for providing that video when you knew you were going to be somewhere that wouldn't allow you easily to participate. But I can see you're still on the line. So do feel that you can take part in the Q&A as well. So that's all the presentations. Thank you so much for everyone to keeping to time. It now means we've got some time for discussion and Q&A. And if there are any of the co-authors who are in the room as well who wanted to say anything, do put your hand up. But I'm going to ask, so Jack, I know you've been keeping an eye on the chat function. Is there any particular question that's coming up that would be helpful?
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions. So the first one that came through was on technology and social media. So they asked, does any of the research indicate the time spent on social media is taking up former volunteering time? We didn't have a paper on that specifically, but I wondered, Debbie, if there's anything from your work on online volunteering that might be relevant to that.
Thanks, Jack. I hope you can hear me. So we don't have enough information about how much social media takes away our time to volunteer, but that we do know that social media creates new platforms for people to volunteer, including micro-volunteering, where people can actually use social media to promote not-for-profits and their causes. Obviously, the more time we spend on these platforms, the less time we have to contribute to the community. So it's one of the emerging barriers, but also an emerging enabler of further volunteering.
Did any other authors have any reflections on that point in relation to social media either being a barrier or enabler? I can see Christel has her hand up.
Well, the young people I interviewed preferred to do the Facebook groups and more the modern opportunities that social media provides, because they didn't like the formal committee structures. I remember there was one young lady who was asked to join her crocheting committee in her club, and the formality just made her run away. So I just found the young people I talked to just preferred the easiness and there's no red tape. It was just much easier to do social media volunteering or getting together with groups online and more casual.
Thanks, Christel. Any other reflections on this one?
So I just wanted to mention Darcy's comment in the chat. They've said that as someone who works in peer support, they've noticed all of that informal networking actually happens through social media. And a lot of people put a significant time into that informal volunteering effort. And I think that is an area where we are seeing growing numbers of people lending their expertise and their skills and their experience in a much more kind of community based way. And it's, I think, just Darcy, a really interesting insight and reflection on the way that people engage in that participation as a form of informal volunteering.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Darcy. Cool. Jack, what other question has been coming through?
Yep, so we had another question, and I think this one was in response to Darja's presentation on leadership. The question was thoughts on if fundraising and event management is part of the role of volunteer leaders. And there might be a bit to say about how that fits in and the effect that has on leadership.
Thanks, Jack. Look, we know, and we do talk about this in the paper a little bit. We know that, one of the key barriers to leaders being sort of truly leaders in the volunteering context is that they have to do a lot. There's a lot of jobs, there's a lot of, functions that they have to take on. And, examples like these, like fundraising and event management are all fall into more administrative part of the role, which sometimes means that, the workload is huge and there's not maybe enough time to be more motivational, inspirational, really thinking about what people in the unit or the club or brigade or whatever need. So it's not necessarily saying that they should or shouldn't. They're saying that it kind of depends on each particular specific scenario to navigate, that workload, and maybe being also more effective with delegation, which is one of the things that we definitely picked up in other research I've done and my colleagues have done, is that you get one person step up in a group, in a volunteering group, and they suddenly end up doing everything. And what they need to be doing is saying, hold on, I am the one person and there's sort of some of us here as well. So how about we start thinking of how I can delegate and offload more effectively, which also gives other people opportunities to step into the leadership role, which is a win-win for everyone.
Thanks, Darja. Does anyone else want to come in on this? Those of you working on leadership research or others? Did anyone else want to come in from the leadership? Yeah, and then I was just going to read out. So a question's just come through on chat about Art and Sarah's paper. In regards to volunteer motivation, did you look at what demotivates volunteers? I don't know if you've got any reflections on that one.
That's a good question. I mean, it's possible that obviously being in a position that does not allow you to fulfill your goals would certainly be demotivating. So it's sort of the inverse of what we said. But I forget who else was talking about barriers and the things that turn volunteers off. That was another paper, I think. So certainly there would be some things that that volunteers don't appreciate. Who was it that briefly mentioned barriers to volunteering? Or
I think Debbie did briefly. The comment, I'll just read it all out. We're seeing more and more a decline in aged care volunteering because of PPE, rat testing, vaccination requirements. The comment says it's not a barrier, but definitely demotivates people. And there's been a huge loss of volunteers in that area.
Well, I come from psychology, so I think it's a sort of psychological truism, that more costs and less rewards are going to, affect motivation and behavior. So to the extent that we make it harder for volunteering, or there's extra steps people have to go through, or extra challenges they have to undertake, and that could include, we've talked, I think, other times about various regulations that people have to adhere to and paperwork that they have to do. Those things can be demotivating, I think, if they're seen as burdens and costs, But again, that's without data. That's just with the psychological hat on.
Thanks, Art. Jack, are there other questions coming through?
Could I also just make a comment about the demotivating? Because there's quite a lot of research around what demotivates, or some research that we've done around what demotivates volunteer, and it's anything from micromanagement to for example, systems that don't work properly, lack of alignment with the purpose of the organization. But one of the most interesting findings that I've seen was that actually tangible rewards tend to demotivate volunteers, because if we start giving them things like, I don't know, a mug or chocolate for their work, people start seeing it as some sort of payment, and it always seems to be undervalued of what they're actually doing. So it was quite interesting to see that actually tangible rewards, instead of untangible, which is recognition and thank you and so on, tangible rewards tended to actually demotivate volunteers, which was quite interesting.
That is interesting. Thank you, Debbie. Jack, any other questions coming through?
Yeah, we've got a lot of questions coming through, so thanks everyone for sending those in. We have the next one just on my screen here is, are there any suggestions on helping with volunteer burnout once it's been identified? And I think there's a few authors who talk about motivation and retention, so really great to get some comments on that one.
I'm happy to talk about burnout because that came, I guess, as one of the key aspects of one of the key reasons that volunteers leave. So it was a big driver of volunteer turnover. I suppose effective management involves minimizing the demands that are placed on volunteers, at some time providing enough and at the same time providing resources such as social and physical and cognitive resources to support that. We also recommend regular check-ins with volunteers about their well-being and kind of identify opportunities where organisations can minimise the demands and pressure volunteers face. Unfortunately, I feel like with volunteers in particular, they're so giving and generous of their time, it can be very easy for them to fall into a situation where they feel like if they don't do it, no one else can. So I think that's just about for the organisation being a bit more aware of that as an issue and potentially monitoring it and improving awareness of it in the organisation.
Thanks, Vivien. Anyone else would like to speak about this? Burnout?
Maybe not, well, I think burnout, but also changing motivations, which is what art and my paper looks into, is really about making sure that you're tapping into volunteers over time to make sure their motivations are still being met. And I wonder if there is an opportunity there for us to do more explicit work across the volunteering ecosystem to make sure that we are actually encouraging people to identify when their motivation might have changed and telling us how we can meet those new motivations. Because a lot of the anecdotal evidence I've heard over the past couple of months in this project is that volunteers generally don't leave for negative reasons so much as that they're looking for a new challenge or want to give back to a different cause. And there's a huge opportunity there to make sure that we are keeping people engaged and motivated and aligning their values with what we're doing, that I sometimes think we forget. And Art's tool is a freely available survey, so something that I would highly encourage people to look at and apply in their own programs.
Thanks, Sarah. Gordon, did you want to make a comment here?
Look, I certainly will. In some of the remote and rural areas, especially in the emergency services, they don't have the support networks that you have in the urban areas. And I have seen volunteers burn out and just throw their gear and just walk away, and they would never go again in areas. I've seen other remote areas where over 10 or 12 years, certain ones have rescued more than 130 or 40 people out of the gorges, Carragini Gorges in Western Australia. Sadly, very few of those were alive. Now, that has a hell of an effect, but there isn't the networks in a lot of those remote and rural areas. And bear in mind, psychologically, Art, is a lot of these people, there's nothing wrong with them, right? You can ask them and they'll tell you there's nothing wrong. So without those support networks in some of those rural and remote areas, it does make it difficult for some of that volunteering. I'm not going to offer any solutions. I just need to flag it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Jack, would you like to pull out another? I know we've got lots of questions coming through now and only a few minutes, but would you like to pull out another one?
Sure. We did have a question on, someone asked if there'd been any research that looked at the age and gender split of volunteers in leadership roles. I wondered, Darja or Christel, if you had anything in your findings that would speak to that.
See, I'm desperately trying to remember what we found. There's definitely research, but you're testing my foggy brain here. So I think Viv was actively, go Viv.
I'm happy to take this one on behalf of our team, Darja. So yes, there is a lot of research in the space of gender distribution in leadership, particularly around the lack of female representation, which I guess is very similar to what we find in corporate organisations. However, in volunteers, that's a little bit more significant. So I've done some research recently with Surf Lifesaving Australia, and they've got some gender issues in the makeup of their organisational leaders, particularly around certain roles. So often we find that women are well represented in administrative roles, in member support roles, but when it comes to presidents or those senior leadership positions, we see a real gap in women in those roles. And whether that's something to do with women they've got other things to worry about in terms of their existing responsibilities, where they're less likely to take on leadership roles, or if it's something underlying some gender differences in terms of women's likelihood to put their hand up. So there's a whole bunch of different issues right now, and we're working with some strategies on how to improve diversity in leadership positions, particularly in volunteers, because this provides an opportunity for women to get some experience in leadership roles, and that can then help facilitate leadership movement in other areas of work.
Thank you, Vivien. I'm really interested in seeing more about that research as well. Lots of nodding heads. Jack, is there maybe one more area, one more question or theme that's coming through the questions?
It's tough. We did get a bit of commentary in the chat about recognition. Someone asked in particular if there was any sort of system that could be in place in terms of volunteer recognition, and Vivien or Darja or anyone else might have found something on that in their work on retention.
Yes, any thoughts on recognition that's coming through the research?
Hugely important. Please don't operate on the assumption that volunteers don't want to be recognized for the work they do. They do want to be recognized. And again, comes back to leadership, right? So we actually in the leadership module we released earlier this year, I believe, with the generous sponsorship by Bushfire National Hazards CRC. One or two of the little videos are focused on recognition and how to do it as a leader, and what are some of the things to think about. And yeah, so it is really important.
Yeah, just to clarify, I did not say that volunteers don't want to be recognized. They do. It's just the tangible rewards that sometimes. Well, there's a really interesting comment about how volunteers did not like when they had a volunteer of the month, because that excluded everyone else who's doing a very important work. So recognition is very important. It just needs to be done carefully.
Christel, did you want to come on this?
Yes, I do agree that recognition is important. When we looked at why community groups were successful, was because their leaders did pat people on the back and thank them for a job well done, made people feel appreciated. So those community organizations were more likely to have people stand for leadership positions.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to start to wrap up now because we've got 4 minutes to go. I was just going to ask if either Mark or Melanie wanted to say anything just to reflect on the session.
I might jump in and hand to you, Melanie, if that's okay. Again, I mentioned it at the beginning. Really appreciate everyone's attendance here today, your active engagement, what community participation is all about. These papers are invaluable pieces of foundation and evidence for us to move forward with what is a fundamentally important piece of work, and that's the development of the national strategy for volunteering. So I want to thank everyone who contributed. I want to thank everyone who engaged today. It's always a pleasure to see people with passion and purpose in the one place. So thank you all.
Thanks, Mark. Melanie?
I would just like to thank the presenters, all of them and their colleagues, for sticking to time and presenting some really valuable and insightful research. I'd also like to thank Volunteering Australia for recognising that academics do have something to offer, can offer something, and we can speak in a way that's accessible to the whole ecosystem. And I've just been so amazed that there are people from WA, from all around Australia, who've been zooming in. So we're using the technology in a way that is that we can pull together a national strategy that will be of value for the next 10 years. So I'm really proud that as a researchers group, we can help to, and I look forward to the next 2 tranches of papers coming your way soon.
Thank you, Melanie. So I will just wrap up. So the papers are all now live on the National Strategy for Volunteering website. There's actually a bonus 8th paper on there, which is by Rong Zhu, which looks at the decline in formal volunteering using the Hilda survey, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Rong unfortunately couldn't be here today to present, but his paper is also alongside the other 7 papers which you've just heard about. Just wanted to add my thank yous, and I wanted to finish with a special thank you for Jack Mcdermott, who is the National Strategy Research Fellow, who leads this initiative at Volunteering Australia. And I really just wanted to publicly thank Jack for the amazing work that he's doing on the initiative and the strategy. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day.